BP says that oil demand will peak as soon as 2025. Welcome to Market Insight, I'm Thomas Warner. BP published a long-range forecast on Wednesday that suggests global demand for oil will top out at 102 million barrels a day next year. The supermajor says that overall demand for energy will increase well into the 2030s, but it's wind and solar that will feed that demand at oil's expense. Well, I'm joined by Viktor Katona. He is head of oil analysis at trade intelligence platform Kpler. Viktor, a very warm welcome to you. Let's start by getting your take on that forecast. Peak oil next year.
Well, I think most probably that is not going to happen. It's really interesting to see that BP is more ambitious in terms of an overall expansion of renewable energy and generally peak oil demand happening than the IEA is, which always was considered to be the ultimate avant-garde of peak oil demand happening as soon as possible. Really. So I think maybe there might be a little bit of the corporate bias involved. BP has been very heavily involved in investing into new clean energies. Maybe that's what's driving the forecast, a little bit of, we want this to happen, rather it will happen. But I think nevertheless, it's a really important piece of a puzzle now that we understand that basically there's no consensus when peak oil demand is happening. It makes the game even more interesting to follow.
Well, always interesting, Viktor, are the monthly OPEC oil reports. They're holding to their forecast for demand growth this year. What did you make of this month's report?
Well, I'm finding it difficult to see where the 2.2 million barrels per day would come from, because the farther out we go in 2024, the more actual statistical evidence we have of demand. And the farther out we go again in 2024, the more evidence points towards 1 million barrel per day rather than the 2, or God forbid, even the 2.2 million barrels per day. So again, a little bit of that bias, I think, is oozing out of that OPEC report. They don't really change. They don't want to change. They want to be seen as oscillating amidst the market conditions of this year. But ultimately, I think that it's quite hard to believe that we have such a stellar demand growth in such a mediocre market that we have currently.
Well, that leads me very nicely back to something you said in our last interview. You said around about 4 or 5 weeks ago that it was too early to conclude that demand growth in 2024 will be disappointing. Is it still too early to conclude that way, do you think, Viktor?
Well, I think it's not disappointing per se. The fact that we have a market that's still growing, I mean, that should be in and of itself, for people who don't really expect the magic to happen. That should be in and of itself a good thing. We're still growing. We're not declining. Peak oil demand isn't happening. Yet at the same time, if someone was ultra bullish, ultra ambitious, and expecting that China would pull off another, 1.5 million barrels per day of domestic demand growth for products, that's not what is going on right now. Effectively, Europe stagnating, United States stagnating, and even the growth in Asia has been capped by the limitations of a lower overall economic growth. So it's not disappointing per se, but anyone who expected more than this current lukewarm environment has been greatly dissatisfied with how things have been going. So it's a bad time for ultra bulls. It's a good time for moderates, I would say. Anyone who has been moderate has been rewarded for that moderation.
Well, Viktor, it's been a very bad time for a lot of people down in the US Gulf Coast. We've had the earliest hurricane since records began, Hurricane Beryl. It didn't really do any damage to regional refineries, though it did take its toll on many people's houses. How concerned do you think that the market should be about future storms in that area?
Well, I think the fact that we have such a powerful storm so early on is definitely concerning. Because again, if we are to believe the meteorologists' forecasts, there would be at least 5-6 storms/hurricanes of similar size and intensity. And if they happen further down the road, when sea temperatures are already even warmer than we currently have, the impacts could be bigger. Luckily, Hurricane Beryl didn't really have any physical damage or large-scale physical damage on refineries and offshore production platforms. It created a lot of havoc for people in and around the Houston area, a lot of people without electricity, flash flooding all over the place. But for the oil industry, this was a non-event. And you saw that in the oil prices this week. Effectively, oil prices tapered off. A lot of that expectation that something bad would happen came back, and ICE Brent back at $85 per barrel, as it was last week before the news of the hurricanes kicking in really started to make the markets fearful.
I'd like to turn our attention to Asia now, Victor. It looks like Russia continues to strengthen its energy links with China and with India. We reported on Wednesday that Novatek is working on selling an Arctic LNG cargo into the Chinese domestic gas market. And of course, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Moscow this week talking about even a free trade agreement. Are we seeing the emergence of an entirely new energy system between Russia and Asian economies, do you think?
Absolutely, yes. And I think it's also driven by a realization both in India and in China that if margins get squeezed, let's say refining margins in the oil industry or gas utilization margins in power generation, wherever that might be, ultimately you need to have a competitive edge. As long as as long as Russian barrels, be that volumes of LNG or crude or oil products, are discounted, China and India will have a competitive edge over the market. And they want to clinch the deals. They want to make sure that ultimately they will have access to these discounted resources for a protracted period of time. And that's what we see right now developing. Narendra Modi being in Moscow, effectively part of the conversation is whether India should have more term supply deals with the Russian exporters. Who's to benefit? Indian refiners. The Russian exporters don't really benefit that much, but the Indian refiners would. And likewise with China. Ultimately, the more that they can clinch, the more that they can get into such a distressed market as Russia is right now, the more they will benefit in the long term.
Head of Oil Analysis at Kpler, Viktor Katona, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts today. And that is Market Insight. Don't forget you can watch more videos on Reuters.com.